The Storm's Gift, a story of unexpected kindness and life-changing encounters. The storm's gift, the thunder crashed overhead like the world was splitting apart. Daniel Rivers pressed his calloused hands against his kitchen table, staring at the pile of overdue bills that seemed to mock him in the flickering light of his single working lamp. The electricity company's final notice glared back at him in bold red letters, a cruel reminder that tomorrow might bring darkness to his already dim world. At 35, Daniel had never imagined his life would look like this. Once a promising automotive engineer, he now scraped by as a freelance mechanic, working out of his garage and taking whatever jobs he could find. The divorce 3 years ago had taken everything: his house, his savings, and worst of all, his 2 children who now lived with their mother in another state. The rain hammered against his small apartment windows with such fury that it seemed personal. Daniel rubbed his tired eyes and checked the time on his phone. Nearly midnight. He should go to bed, but sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford. Too many nights were spent worrying about rent, about his kids, about whether he'd ever climb out of this hole he'd fallen into. That's when the doorbell rang. Daniel froze. Who could possibly be at his door at this hour, especially in weather that would send most people running for cover? Living in this neighborhood had taught him to be cautious. Late-night visitors usually meant trouble. Another ring, followed by desperate knocking. Through the peephole, Daniel could make out 2 figures huddled together on his doorstep, their silhouettes barely visible through the torrential rain. Young women, by the look of them, soaked to the bone and shivering, against every instinct screaming at him to keep the door locked. Daniel found himself reaching for the chain. Something about their posture, the way they clung to each other, reminded him of vulnerability rather than threat. It reminded him of his own daughter. 12 and living 3 states away. "Please," came a voice through the door, barely audible over the storm. "We just need help." Daniel opened the door, and the full force of the storm hit him like a physical blow. Standing before him were 2 young women who couldn't have been much older than 20. Identical twins with dark hair plastered to their heads and designer clothes that were completely soaked through. "I'm so sorry to bother you," the taller of the 2 said, her teeth chattering violently. "Our car broke down about a mile from here. We've been walking in this storm for hours. Everyone else we've asked," she trailed off, looking defeated. "They just slammed their doors in our faces," the second twin finished, her voice breaking slightly. Daniel looked at them closely. Despite their expensive clothes, even soaked, he could tell their coats and shoes cost more than he made in a month. There was something genuine about their distress. Their fear seemed real, their desperation authentic. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "You'll freeze out there." The relief on their faces was so profound it made Daniel's chest tighten. "Thank you," they said almost in unison, stumbling into his modest living room. "Thank you so much." Daniel grabbed the only 2 clean towels he had from his bathroom, trying not to feel embarrassed about their threadbare condition. Everything in his apartment showed the wear of a man barely getting by. The furniture was secondhand, the walls needed paint, the heating system made concerning noises. "I'm Daniel," he said, handing them the towels. "Daniel Rivers." "I'm Emma," said the taller twin, wrapping the towel around her shoulders like it was made of gold. "And this is my sister Grace. We can't thank you enough. We thought we might actually die out there." "Where's your car now?" Daniel asked, closing the door against the howling wind. "About a mile north on Elm Street," Grace replied, smiling her dark hair dry. "It just started making this horrible grinding sound and completely died. We're not from around here." "We were," she paused, glancing at her sister with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. "We were visiting someone." Daniel noticed the exchange but didn't press. Elm Street wasn't exactly the kind of area where people made social visits, especially not young women who looked like they belonged in magazine advertisements. But everyone had their reasons, and he respected privacy. "Elm Street isn't safe to be stranded at night," he said gently. "You did the right thing looking for help." As the twins dried off, Daniel couldn't help but notice details that didn't quite add up. Their clothes were clearly expensive designer dresses that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget. Leather boots that looked handcrafted, jewelry that caught the light even in his dim apartment. What were girls like these doing in his rundown neighborhood after midnight? The phone's in the kitchen, if you want to try calling for help, he offered, pushing his curiosity aside. Whatever their story, they were clearly in genuine distress. Emma tried his landline first, then her cell phone, pressing buttons with growing frustration. The storm must have knocked out the phone lines too, she said, her shoulders sagging with defeat. And there's no cell signal. Daniel felt that familiar protective instinct rise in his chest. The same drive that had once made him work 18-hour days trying to build a future for his family. The same instinct that reminded him every single day that he had 2 children somewhere who might need help from a stranger someday. "Look," he said, the words coming out before he could second-guess himself. "You can't go anywhere in this weather. The forecast said this storm's supposed to last until morning. You're welcome to stay here until then." The twins exchanged glances, and Daniel could see the internal debate playing out on their faces. Trust a stranger or brave the storm. Neither option was particularly appealing for 2 young women alone. "We don't want to impose," Grace said carefully, her voice carrying an accent that spoke of private schools and country clubs. "You've already done so much. You're not imposing," Daniel assured them, managing a self-deprecating smile. "I've got a couch that pulls out into a bed. It's not the 4 seasons, but it's dry and warm." He paused, suddenly self-conscious about his humble surroundings. "Though I should warn you, breakfast options are pretty limited. I think I have some cereal and maybe bread for toast." For the first time since they'd arrived, both women smiled. Real smiles that transformed their faces completely. "That sounds absolutely perfect," Emma said, and something in her tone suggested she meant it more than politeness required, as Daniel helped them settle in. Pulling sheets and blankets from his linen closet, he found himself drawn into conversation. The twins were articulate and engaging, with a warmth that gradually filled the empty spaces in his apartment. They asked about his work, his life, the neighborhood. Usually Daniel avoided personal topics. The pain was still too raw. But something about their genuine interest, their complete lack of judgment about his circumstances, made him open up in ways he hadn't in years. "I'm a mechanic now," he found himself saying, as he made them hot chocolate with the last of his cocoa powder. "Used to be an automotive engineer. Had my own shop for a while." "That sounds fascinating," Grace said, settling onto his couch with her hands wrapped around the steaming mug. "What kind of work did you do?" Daniel's throat tightened as memories flooded back. "Custom modifications, mostly. Performance upgrades for racing teams, specialty vehicles. I had a good thing going for about 8 years. "What happened?" Emma asked gently, then immediately looked stricken. "Sorry, that's probably too personal." "It's okay," Daniel said, surprised by his own willingness to share. The storm outside seemed to create a bubble of intimacy, making confessions feel safe. "My life kind of fell apart 3 years ago. Divorce, business partnership went bad. Had to sell everything just to pay the legal fees." He thought about stopping there, but something in their eyes, a compassion that seemed far beyond their years, encouraged him to continue. "I have 2 kids," he said quietly, the words scraping his throat raw. "Tommy's 14 now. Jessica's 12. They live with their mother in Colorado." The twins' expressions shifted. "It's becoming impossibly gentle." "That must be incredibly difficult," Grace said softly. Being so far from them, Daniel's vision blurred as emotion crashed over him like the storm outside. "Yeah, it is. I call them every week, but it's not the same as being there. I miss everything. Baseball games, school plays, just tucking them in at night. Last month, Jessica got her first boyfriend, and I had to hear about it 3 days later in a text message." His voice cracked on the last words, and he turned away, embarrassed by his display of emotion in front of these young strangers. "What happened?" Emma asked with infinite gentleness. "With your wife, I mean?" Daniel took a shaky breath. "Claire said I was never present, that I cared more about building my business than being a husband and father. She wasn't wrong. I thought providing for them was the same as loving them, but I was missing their actual lives." The pain in his voice seemed to fill the small room, mixing with the sound of rain against the windows. She moved to Colorado for a fresh start, Daniel continued. Wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, said she needed distance from all the memories. The court gave her primary custody. I see Tommy and Jessica during summer break and alternating holidays when I can afford the plane ticket. How often is that? Grace asked, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. This year might be the first time I miss summer, Daniel admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Work's been slow, and the lawyer fees ate up most of my savings. I've been trying to put money aside, but he gestured helplessly at the pile of bills on his kitchen table. The twins listened, with a level of empathy that seemed impossible for their age. They asked thoughtful questions, shared stories of their own childhood, and gradually Daniel felt some of the crushing loneliness that had become his constant companion begin to ease. You know what strikes me about everything you've told us? Emma said after a long moment of comfortable silence. You're still fighting for them? Even when everything fell apart, even when it would be easier to give up. You're still trying to be their father. They're my whole world, Daniel said simply. Even if I can't be with them every day, I want them to know their dad never stopped loving them. Never stopped trying, as the evening wore on. Daniel learned that Emma and Grace had grown up in Connecticut, that they were both 22 and recent college graduates. They spoke fondly of their childhood, but remained vague about their family circumstances, mentioning only that their father was in business and deflecting when Daniel asked for specifics. He sensed there was much more to their story, but he respected their privacy. After all, he was a stranger who'd taken them in for the night. They didn't owe him their life stories, you know, Emma said as Daniel prepared the pull-out couch with his best sheets. We've stayed in some pretty fancy hotels over the years, but I don't think I've ever felt as welcome anywhere as I do right here. That's very kind of you to say, Daniel replied, tucking the sheets around the thin mattress. But I'm sure you're just being polite about my humble accommodations. No, really, Grace insisted, her voice carrying a sincerity that made Daniel look up from his work. It's not about the place, it's about the person. You opened your door to complete strangers in the middle of a storm. You shared your food, your home, your story. Not many people would do that. I have kids, Daniel said simply, the truth of it settling in his chest like a warm ember. If Tommy and Jessica were ever stranded somewhere, scared and alone, I'd hope someone would help them. I'd pray someone would see past their own fears and just be kind. As they settled in for the night, the twins whispering softly to each other on the pull-out couch, Daniel lay in his own bed listening to the storm gradually losing its fury outside. For the first time in months, his small apartment didn't feel empty. The soft murmur of voices, the knowledge that he'd helped someone, the simple human connection, it all reminded him of better times when his home had been filled with family sounds and laughter. He drifted off to sleep, thinking about kindness, about the strange turns of fate that had brought these two young women to his door, and about how sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can feel like the most important things in the world. The revelation the next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean. Daniel woke early, as was his habit developed from years of trying to squeeze more productivity into each day. He found both twins already awake, sitting at his kitchen table and speaking in hushed, urgent tones that stopped the moment they saw him. Good morning, he said, offering them coffee in his mismatched mugs. How did you sleep? Better than we have in weeks, Emma said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Something in her tone suggested she meant more than just physical rest. After a simple breakfast of toast and the last of his orange juice, Daniel offered to drive them back to their car. The twins accepted, though he noticed they seemed strangely reluctant to leave. Exchanging meaningful glances he couldn't interpret, during the short drive through his neighborhood, now peaceful in the morning sunlight, they were quieter than they'd been the night before. Daniel caught them looking at him in ways that made him self-conscious, as if they were memorizing his face. Their car sat exactly where they'd left it on Elm Street. A sleek Mercedes with Connecticut plates that looked even more out of place in the rundown neighborhood in daylight. Daniel popped the hood and examined the engine, his mechanical experience coming in handy. Your timing belt snapped, he diagnosed, pointing to the problem. It's a relatively easy fix, but you'll need to have it towed to a shop. Shouldn't be too expensive. The twins called their insurance company on Daniel's phone, and within an hour, a tow truck arrived. As they prepared to leave with the driver, Emma pressed something into Daniel's hand, a business card with elegant embossed lettering. "If you ever need anything," she said, her eyes unusually bright with emotion, "anything at all, please call this number." Daniel glanced at the card without really focusing on it. Too caught up in the strange sadness of saying goodbye to these two young women who had briefly brought light into his dark world. "Thank you," he said, pocketing the card. "Take care of yourselves. Drive safely." As the tow truck disappeared around the corner, taking Emma and Grace with it, Daniel felt the familiar weight of loneliness settle back on his shoulders. The brief interlude of companionship was over, and he was back to his reality of unpaid bills, empty rooms, and the crushing worry about whether he'd see his children this summer. For the next 2 weeks, Daniel threw himself into his work with renewed energy. He finally landed a decent contract rebuilding an engine for a local delivery company that would help him catch up on some bills and maybe, if he was careful with every penny, put aside enough for a plane ticket to Colorado. He thought about Emma and Grace occasionally, wondering if they'd made it home safely. But the demands of daily survival soon pushed them to the background of his mind. The business card sat forgotten in his jeans pocket, going through the wash twice before he finally pulled it out and set it on his dresser without really reading it then. On a Tuesday morning, that started like any other. Everything changed. Daniel was under the hood of a pickup truck, wrench in hand, when he heard a car door slam in his driveway. He glanced up to see a black sedan that probably cost more than most people's houses. And climbing out of it was a man in a suit that screamed wealth and power. But it wasn't the stranger that made Daniel's wrench slip from his suddenly nerveless fingers. It was the two young women who emerged from the back seat, looking exactly as he remembered them, but somehow different, more confident, more purposeful. Emma and Grace walked toward him with smiles that seemed to light up the entire garage, followed by the older man who carried himself with the unmistakable aura of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Daniel," Emma called out, and the genuine joy in her voice made his chest tight with emotion. "We told you we'd be back, Mr. Rivers," the man said, extending a manicured hand with a warm smile. "My name is William Hartford. I believe you've met my daughters." The world seemed to tilt sideways as the pieces fell into place. Hartford, as in Hartford Industries, the massive conglomerate he'd seen on billboards and news reports his entire adult life, as in one of the wealthiest families in America. "You're their father," Daniel managed, his voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. "I am," William Hartford said, his grip firm and reassuring. "And I understand I owe you a debt of gratitude that I can never fully repay." Emma stepped forward, her eyes already filling with tears. "We told him everything, Daniel. How you were the only person who helped us that night. How you opened your home to complete strangers. How kind you were, even though you were struggling yourself. Dad wanted to come sooner," Grace added quickly, "but we asked him to wait. We needed to be sure about something first." Daniel's head was spinning. The garage seemed to sway around him as he tried to process what was happening. "Sure about what?" William Hartford's smile widened. Daniel could see where his daughters had inherited their warmth and genuine nature. "My daughters are excellent judges of character, Mr. Rivers. They insisted on doing some research before we approached you." "Research?" Daniel asked, confusion and growing alarm warring in his chest. "About your children?" Emma said softly, her voice gentle but direct. "About your custody situation, your financial struggles, your work history, everything you shared with us that night." Daniel felt heat flood his face. His private struggles, his failures, his desperate financial situation, it had all been investigated, cataloged, probably discussed in boardrooms and family meetings. The humiliation was crushing. "Please don't be angry," Grace said quickly, seeing his expression change. "We weren't trying to invade your privacy. We wanted to help the way you helped us." "Help?" Daniel's voice cracked. "I don't understand what's happening here." William Hartford stepped forward, his expression serious but kind. "Mr. Rivers, I'm the CEO of Hartford Industries. We have manufacturing facilities, research divisions, and development projects across the country. I've reviewed your engineering background. I'm genuinely impressed by your qualifications. Daniel gripped the truck's bumper, his knees threatening to give out. I still don't understand. What I'm about to offer you, William said carefully, is not charity. It's not pity. It's good business mixed with the recognition of exceptional character. My company is expanding our Colorado operations, and we need talented engineers who understand that success means nothing without integrity. The world seemed to slow down as William Hartford continued speaking. I'm offering you a position as senior mechanical engineer with Hartford Industries' Denver facility. The salary would be sufficient to allow you to relocate closer to your children and pursue increased custody if you choose. You'd be working on projects that matter: clean energy initiatives, sustainable manufacturing, technology that changes communities. Daniel's vision blurred as the magnitude of what he was hearing hit him like a physical blow. That's impossible. You can't just offer someone a job because they let your daughter sleep on their couch. You're right, William said with a laugh that held no mockery, only warmth. I can't. That's not how business works. But I can offer a job to someone whose character has been thoroughly tested and proven. Do you know what my daughters told me about that night? Daniel shook his head, unable to speak. They told me about a man who had every reason to be bitter, who was struggling to survive, who could barely keep his own lights on, and who still opened his door to strangers in a storm. They told me about someone who shared his food, his shelter, his story without asking for anything in return. Emma wiped her eyes, but her voice was steady. Dad's built his entire company around the idea that success is meaningless unless you lift others up with you. For years, he's been looking for people who understand that principle instinctively. We weren't in your neighborhood by accident that night, Grace admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly. Well, the car really did break down. But we were there because Dad's been considering some community development projects in that area. We'd been driving around getting a feel for the neighborhood, William nodded. When their car died and they started knocking on doors, it became an unintentional test of the community's character. 17 houses, Mr. Rivers. They knocked on 17 doors before yours. 17 families who looked through their peepholes and decided not to get involved. Daniel felt tears streaming down his face as the full impact hit him. How close he'd come to being number 18. How easily he could have looked through that peephole and decided he had enough problems of his own. But there's more. William continued, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a folder. Hartford Industries sponsors comprehensive education programs for employees' children. Tommy and Jessica would qualify for full college scholarships when the time comes. Plus, tutoring support, summer programs, whatever they need to succeed. The folder slipped from Daniel's numb fingers. Papers scattering across his garage floor like leaves. He sank down onto a work stool, his legs finally giving out completely. The sobs came from somewhere deep in his chest. 3 years of held-back pain and desperate hope finally breaking free. Why? He whispered through his tears. Why would you do this for a stranger? Emma knelt beside him, her hand gentle on his shoulder. Because you weren't a stranger to us when it mattered most. You were family. Grace joined them, her own eyes wet with tears. And because Dad taught us that success is meaningless unless you use it to change lives. That night, sitting in your kitchen, listening to you talk about your children, we knew we'd found someone special. William Hartford's voice was thick with emotion. My daughters could have called me that night. They could have used their credit cards for a hotel. But they didn't, because sometimes life puts us exactly where we need to be. That storm wasn't just weather, Mr. Rivers. It was opportunity for them to learn something profound about real kindness, and for me to find the kind of person I want representing my company. As Daniel sat there in his humble garage, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered, he thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago. Successful, driven, focused entirely on building his career, while his family life crumbled around him. That man might have looked at Emma and Grace and seen potential networking opportunities. But the man he'd become, broken, humbled, stripped of everything except his core values, had seen 2 frightened young women who needed help. And in choosing compassion over caution, kindness over fear, he'd opened a door to possibilities he never could have imagined. "There's just one condition," William said with a grin, helping Daniel to his feet. "Thanksgiving dinner is at our house this year. Emma and Grace insist, and when my daughters make up their minds about something, resistance is futile." Daniel laughed through his tears, the sound rusty from disuse, but absolutely genuine. "I accept all of it. The job, the opportunity, the dinner invitation." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "I can't believe this is real." "It's real," Emma assured him. "And Daniel, there's something else. Dad's already spoken with the best family law attorney in Colorado. If you want to pursue increased custody, we'll have the best legal support available." For the first time in 3 years, Daniel allowed himself to truly imagine the future. Seeing Tommy and Jessica more than just during school breaks, being there for soccer games and parent-teacher conferences, tucking them in at night and reading bedtime stories in person instead of over crackling phone lines. But more than that, he'd learned something precious about the ripple effects of human kindness. About how opening your door to help others really does open your heart to let blessings flow in. 6 months later, Daniel Rivers stood in his new office in Denver, looking out at the Rocky Mountains and thinking about the sustainable energy project he was about to begin. Technology that would provide clean power to rural communities across the state. In the distance, he could see the middle school where Tommy and Jessica now spent half their time. Living with him under the joint custody agreement that had finally been approved, his phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Dad's got a new project in Seattle. Guess who's the lead engineer? Also, can you make it to Sunday dinner this week? Mom's making her famous pot roast." Daniel smiled, typing back, "Wouldn't miss it. Family dinner is sacred." And it was true. Because sometimes when you open your door to strangers in a storm, you don't just give them shelter. You invite miracles into your own life. The storm that brought Emma and Grace. Hartford to Daniel's door that night had lasted only hours. But the kindness he showed them was going to last forever, rippling out through generations, changing lives in ways he was only beginning to understand. Because in the end, we're all just strangers in the storm, hoping someone will hear our knock and choose to open the door. And sometimes, when we're brave enough to be that someone for others, we discover that love and compassion really can change everything.